Hello everyone, my name is Tze Kang, the expert tutor of Performance Management PM. In this video, we will discuss one of the technical topics in the syllabus, learning curve. The following references will be made in this video on the topic for learning curve, which is mainly coming from the ACCA resources, namely Study Hub, which is found in Chapter 10, in particular, Section 10.4. Secondly, the technical articles with the title, The Learning Rate and Learning Effect. Lastly, the questions that appear in the past examinations and the practice exam that found in practice platform. It is all highly recommended that students should go through all these resources while watching this video or after watching the video. There will be the following discussion that covered in this video on learning curve. Firstly, what exactly is learning curve? Second, how are we dealing with learning curve? And finally, how would learning curve be appeared in the exam of performance management? Let's take a look at some backgrounds on learning curve. Firstly, it is a short-term phenomenon that arising in the business environment that is highly labor intensive. And the story background of these environment originating from an aircraft making businesses during World War II. In this environment, business activity were highly repetitive. Production in particular are referring to the nature of works carried out by the worker are just similar or the same day after day. With these two criteria, that's where the learning curve were being discovered. In short, the phenomena is represented by the following diagram. When the cumulative output, which could be measured either by units or by batches, depending on the nature of the production, it is discovered that the cumulative average time measured by hours per unit or per batch. From now on, let's refer as CAH per U or CAH per B. This reading will decline as the workers start picking up the skills and experiences as the production increases. However, this improvement in the speed and efficiency will end and stabilize at a reading called YS. That is where the learning effect have stopped appearing and a steady state of efficiency has now come in place. In short, the two stages of this diagram represented by the following statement. During the first stage, at the initial stage of work, as cumulative output increases, the cumulative average hour per unit of batches decline. That's where the speed or efficiency improved due to appearance of learning effect. However, the moment the workers has picked up all the necessary skills and experiences, it has no further rooms of improvement. That's where the second phase has set in. The cumulative average hours per unit of batch will now be stabilized at YS. Whatever outputs has increased further, that will be the constant speed and efficiency. This is a stage where there is no more learning effects because the learning curve has reached its plateau. Once we have got a rough idea what learning curve effect is all about, let's take a look at how are we dealing with learning curve in mathematical context. The most fundamental and important understanding on dealing with learning curve is to know the definition, what exactly learning curve effect is all about. It is said to be when output, particularly when the cumulative output is double, the cumulative average hour per unit or batch will reduce to L% of the last reading. What exactly is L%? Let's take a look at the asterisk below. The L percentage is said to be the learning rate. Guys, according to the history, the very first learning curve phenomena were found. The learning rate at the time was found at 80%. And in fact, this is one of the very common used statistics that tested in exam, even though it is not a guarantee on this. It is one of the common used statistics quoted in examination. When output is double, what do we mean by cumulative average hour per unit or batch? To understand further about such number, let's refer to double asterisk below. The cumulative average hour spent per unit or batch simply refers to the average time spent for an unit or a batch of the production as output increases. And this is definitely the most fundamental numbers that you need to be able to calculate and derive in exam. Here are the following simple examples showing the way to derive the cumulative average hours per unit or batch. Supposing there's a new product where the time spent in making the very first unit was 6 hours. And the factory has discovered a learning rate of 70%. With these two statistics, what exactly is the cumulative average hour spent? Let's say, for 1 unit, how long it takes on average per unit. For 2 units, how long it takes on average per unit, and for 3 and 4, etc. To derive this figure, the following are the most common used approach to work out the answer. It is mainly referring to the tabular approach, where a table below will be constructed in your working table if the questions appear as a multiple choice, or if the questions appear in section C, you will present these in your Excel spreadsheet. The first is x-axis in the diagram that we have seen earlier, which is the cumulative outputs that measure either by units or batch, according to what the question says. Second column is the y that found in the diagram, which indicated by cumulative average hour, in this case per unit. Given the 4 level of output as required by the questions, we always will start based upon the figures given, the time that spent and took on making the first ever units of the products, which obviously it was at 6 hours. This is not only the time spent for the first unit, it is also the average time spent per unit if the quantity is just 1. With the 6 hours, when, by definition, output get doubled, the cumulative average hour will be 70% of the previous one. The following calculation is going by definition. That is where the approach is named. Of course, the double of 2 will become 4. When output is doubled to become 4, the average time spent per unit will again be 70% of the previous reading, which is 4.2 multiplied by 0.7. That comes to 2.94. Another way of showing the calculation is just taking the time spent for the first unit, which is 6, multiplied the learning rate to the power of 2, simply because they have doubled for twice from 1 unit to 4. So whichever workings that we used, the result is just the same at 2.94. Do you notice that, guys? When we go by definition, we only could apply this formula to work out the cumulative average time spent per unit when only the output is double. How about if the output is not increased by double? Not to worry, because there is another approach that we could use in deriving the reading. That is by formula. This is the formula that shows the mathematical functions of the curve that we saw earlier. The curvilinear line is now represented by a function of y equals to ax to the power of b. Y, as discussed earlier, it's the cumulative average hours per unit or batch, whereas a is the constant. That represents by the time spent for the first unit or batch. Whereas x is the independent variables, which is at the horizontal axis that is shown as discussed earlier. Cumulative output that also measure by either units or batches. Last but not least, the function of B, it's called the learning effect function, that is derived with the formula of log learning rate divided by log 2. Whatever learning rate given by the questions with the scientific functions in the calculator or at the electronic calculator shown in the spreadsheet during the exam, students should be able to derive the learning effects. And advice for you, when you are to write down the learning effect of B, try to take up to 4 decimal at least to ensure the precision and accuracy of the results that found later. So based upon this reading, we will apply this formula to work out the cumulative average hour per unit, which is Y, by replacing A with 6, X according to the units, or the outputs accordingly, with the B of negative 0.5146. Here will become the result. And guys, do you notice that? Apart from the fact when output is double, regardless of the output, by using the formula, we will be able to derive the reading of Y. That's including when the output has come 3. What we have to do is just to take the 6 as A and 3 as the X to the power of B. That will give rise to 3.409. This reading is therefore taken and replaced into the first column of Y. So here are the 2 ways in deriving the cumulative average hours per unit or batch, namely by definition, with restriction of doubling the output. Second, by formula, without restrictions on the doubling rules. So, with the figure of cumulative average hours per unit, what else could the questions be testing? Guys, the calculation of CAH per unit is just the first questions in most examinations. The first questions will then lead to the next following questions, which is found as below. Questions 2 and 3. Guys, this was the figures that we have derived above, the cumulative average hours per unit or batch. What the question could test in exam is that from this number, how are we to derive the cumulative time, the cumulative hours indeed? And thirdly, how are we to determine the incremental time spent for a specific output which measured by unit or batch? To derive the second and the third questions, let's extend from example 1 above. The first 2 columns was extracting from the above. The cumulative output is still required the same to be 1, 2, 3, and 4. The cumulative average hour per unit was copied and extracted from the above. Once we know how long it took on average to make 1 unit, we just got to multiply with the output. That will give rise to the cumulative hours as such. The average time spent per unit or batch multiplied with number of units or batches, that will give rise to cumulative hours. Guys, it is worth taking note. When you look at cumulative time or hours for 2 units, the 8.4 hours would have included the 6 hours for the first unit. If 6 hours is included in here, what's the difference representing by? The difference of 2.4 hours is obviously the time you spend in making the second unit. That's how you derive the incremental time spent for the specific output. Similarly will apply when you know the cumulative time for 2 units and 3 units. Again, the 8.4 hours is included in 10.227. Once again, what's the incremental? What's the difference it's representing? That again represents the time spent for the incremental output on the third unit. Similarly apply to derive the reading on the time span in making the fourth unit of the products. So everything started with cumulative average hour per unit of batches. You will be able to derive the cumulative time and the incremental time span accordingly. Guys, once we manage to find the three set of numbers at this point, what more can the exam questions be testing? Here comes two additional tasks that will be tested in performance management. Questions 4. If the results of cumulative average hour per unit, cumulative hours, incremental time span can all be derived based upon the statistics as shown and discussed above. One of the key elements that exam questions in performance management will be testing is to test the students the ability to walk backwards from these channels to derive one of the key figures, namely to derive the learning rate. As such, the following questions is to show and demonstrate the rationale in deriving the learning rate. By denotes, it is called as LR percentage. The following are the idea and the rationale in deriving the learning rate as tested in the performance management examination. As we have said earlier, based upon the cumulative average hour per unit or per batch, we will be able to derive the cumulative time as shown above, as well as the incremental time span. So do you see that, guys? The relationship of these three items are so crucial in dealing with the questions on learning curve in exam. And now, given the fact we're looking at learning rate, where do you find learning rate? How do you derive the learning rate? The clue, it's all coming from the cumulative time. So all the workings to derive the learning rate will have to base upon the readings, the result that you found on the cumulative time or cumulative hours. Let's see the following approach to derive the learning rate. There are two methods. Of the two, guys, it is the first method I will be sharing in detail, given it is more practical, it is more doable during the exam with the time constraint. It is the method one that following the definition, as we have said a while ago. Given that these were the statistics, these were the figures that we have derived from the above. So, should the question asked, how do we derive the learning rate based upon these reading? What we have to do is just to think backwards. Given that the 4.2 hours, as we have discussed a while ago, it was derived by taking 70% of the last cumulative average hour, and if the question is to ask for the learning rate, what we have to do is to leave the learning rate as the unknown. And it is now coming to the very simple mathematics by shifting the 6 to the other side and divide it against the 4.2. That gives rise to the learning rate. That is one of the easiest and direct way of deriving the learning rate. Should the figures given is based on 1 and 2 units. Have you thought of what the questions is providing to you instead of 2, they provide the reading of 4? Well, if the cumulative outputs given in the questions is 4, obviously, this number will be given. The cumulative hours will be given, and therefore the cumulative hours per unit per batch are all be available, which is 2.94 and 11.76. So from this number, what we have to do is just to base upon the reading of 2.94 as the cumulative average hour per unit, As we have discussed a while ago, the 2.94 could be derived based upon the second way of expressing the definition, 6 multiplied 0.7 to the power of 2. Once again, you are still going to find the learning rate by leaving these as an unknown. I'm sure by reading through the article as discussed above, by going through some mathematical exercises, you will be able to derive the learning rate by attempting to remove the power sign using the root function. This is how learning rate is derived by definition. For knowledge, the second method, it is just going back to the formula by looking at the formula of ax to the power of b to derive at the y of cumulative average per unit. Your job, your task, guys, is to find the learning rate percentage in the function of b. I'm sure it is just a matter of time and how tedious the process is to derive the learning rate from b function. Given the time constraint, this is the method which I would not recommend. Conclusion, when the question is asking for learning rate, practice and apply method 1 to derive the according figures as required. Here comes the final questions and tasks that to be asked in PM. Once we have derived the learning rates from questions 4, now it is the fifth and the final questions that will be tested in performance management. As discussed at the beginning of this video, learning curve will reach a plateau at a point of time. And the questions would likely to ask the students, find the steady state of the learning effect. At what level of output, particularly at what cumulative output level, there is no learning curve effect demonstrated. So what you have to do, guys, is going back to the first two columns that we have said. When you have derived the cumulative average hour per unit from the above illustration, we stopped at the output of 4 units and the reading was at 2.94. What you have to do is just to keep going on. It is more like a try and error. Try off for 5 units, try off for 6 units, try off for 7 units, try off for 8 units until the point the cumulative average hour per unit, when you move to the next unit, the reading remain the same already. These two numbers, once is found to be the same, that means there is no further reduction in the average time spent per unit because the learning curve has stopped there. So therefore, looking at the last figure and referring to the quantity of x, we can therefore conclude in the exam the learning curve effect ended at x unit of the output. Obviously, the questions in exam are likely to provide most of this number, and you are just asked to indicate by pointing out what exactly is the output, despite the fact students are still required to be able to walk through the trial and error processes to find the cumulative average hour per unit that remains stagnant based upon the formula that we had discussed earlier. That will be the last type of the calculation that you will be get in exam. Finally, to summarize the 5 set of the questions that to be appeared in the exam, here are the relevance of learning curve topic in the exam of performance management. Firstly, there will be questions on multiple choice as shown on the screen that asking the students to derive the learning rate based upon the information given. As we say, the learning rate is one of the questions that were discussed a while ago under questions 4. What you have to do is to apply the approach of questions 4 in dealing with the multiple choice. It is a typical questions 4. And based upon the table that we have established, according to the information provided, these hours of 250, it's clearly the A, time spent for the first batch. And then we are given the time that took in making the first 16 batches. This is clearly cumulative time or hours for 16 batches of output. Guys, with cumulative output, cumulative hours, and the A, just apply the approach that we have discussed in questions 4. Using method 1, you will be able to derive the learning rate. I'm sure by following the steps as we demonstrate in the video, you will be able to get the learning rate with the amount coming to 80%. That is a task that, guys, give a try on this. And for a more detailed working demonstration, you may refer to the articles as described above. Finally, there's one more kind of questions that may expect the students to demonstrate some discussion. How would learning curve be considered in the context of compiling, preparing, formulating the budget, and making decisions such as pricing? How would learning curve affect the cost of the product to set the pricing? Last but not least, how would learning curve be affecting the measurement of performances comparing to the target? So learning curve effect is appearing in virtually all scope of the syllabus of performance management, budgeting, decision making, performance measurement. As such, the references from the study hub and technical articles will provide a sufficient and a very detailed illustrations on dealing with such discussive nature of the task. Until then, take care.